to today's video. Today I've got a very special guest. Is my friend Jared Gimbel. Jared
Hello.
speaks probably 30 plus languages to a conversational level, and many of them minority languages that will be extremely hard to find resources for. So, Jared, do you want to give a quick, brief introduction to yourself?
I definitely can do that. Also, I'll just simply let you know that I'm not absolutely conversational in all of the 31, but I would say probably about half of them I have degrees of professional fluency in them. Definitely to give some introduction as to exactly who I am. So I was born in Boston, Massachusetts to a Ashkenazi Jewish father and also a Swedish American mom who converted to Judaism. And so as a result, throughout my life, I felt myself tossed between separate cultures, also with a significant identity confusion. And so also having moved to 4 different states and then later on 4 different countries as an adult, it also occurred to me that pretty much no matter what I did, I also had a feeling that I was somehow a member of everywhere and also a member of nowhere. And so one result of this is that I've always been very, very curious about the world over. And I also realize that as things stand, it seems that I have only one chance to live on this planet, and I really want to find out as much as I want to and am able to about the various cultures that are present in it, as well as thinking about it, as well as finding out, for example, how I could build bridges between cultures that may historically have been enemies or may have significantly diplomatic hard times. And so I also realize that nowadays there is a lot of mutual distrust and a lot of difficult emotions that are definitely present in the world, and I think mass media and corporatism are very much a part of that. And so as a result, I think that language learners are a definite way to save the world, that learning languages cause people to really understand each other, to meet across boundaries and realize that all human beings are actually not quite that different from each other, despite everything. And so to date,
So,
what did you say?
going off that, two quick questions going with that. The first one is, so it sounds like you were a lot of people in the online community now. You look at them and they say from the age of 19, 20, they only spoke English, but it sounds like you spoke quite a few languages from quite a young age. And the second thing I wanted to say is that it sounds like for you that language is a means of discovering a new culture, a means of understanding how other people think and becoming kind of closer to the way people's works better. You can understand the culture better, and it's almost like an adventure of discovery.
That's very true. One moment of correction, actually, my only native, well, actually, I have 3 native languages. One of them was American English, the other one was French that I forgot later in life because my dad wanted to work in French West Africa. That dream was not realized, and so as a result, I learned some French as a child and then forgot it, and then later on, I learned the Hebrew of the Bible, and that's my second native language, and I've known how to read the Hebrew scriptures through pretty much my entire life. And so another thing, yes, it is to some degree a cultural exploration in many regards. And also, it makes you really realize exactly, paradoxically, how different we really are, and also how similar we really are, and that both the similarities and the differences really deserve to be celebrated. And so, right now, it seems likely that I'm going to be in Fiji during the summer. And so, one result of this in learning Fijian is that I've actually been seeing a lot of similarities to many languages throughout the world, not just from Oceania, mind you, but also some languages in Europe and well beyond that. And of course, sometimes I have periodic flashbacks to various other areas of the world in which I've learned languages, including but not limited to, my time in Israel, my time in Sweden, Germany, Poland, Greenland, and beyond.
It's quite interesting what you've been saying, and coming at the angle what we were talking about of discovery. But right now, a lot of my attention is about learning to read and write Chinese characters, and they are thousands of years old, some of them. And when you have a character with a set meaning, you can really see the way that people thought about the world back then. And some of them are good, some of them not so good. You can see, for example, the character for that, well, the word for globe, Earth, in Chinese has the character ball in it. See, that means probably thousands of years ago they knew the Earth was round. And you look at other examples, and like the character for wife is a girl and it's got a broom and an apron in, so you can tell how sexist they were back there. And there's some good, some bad, but you can generally get a lot better an appreciation of what time was like back then. I think that's quite that sense of discovery and personal interest is incredibly important, in my opinion.
You're reminding me of my various discoveries with Creole languages. My dad actually worked both in Papua New Guinea and Sierra Leone, both of which different English Creoles are actually spoken, one of them being Tok Pisin, which is a language that unites Papua New Guinea in many regards, being the language that I believe the most citizens are proficient in. And then, of course, in Sierra Leone, or Salon, as it's sometimes called in the lingo, has Creole. And so, as a result, one thing that I've really noticed is that the various elements of a culture that seemed very much untouched for a long time by the ways of the West, and to some degree that is a very enchanting thing, is still very much alive in a lot of Creole languages.
Yeah, that's really good. So moving on from the next thing I wanted to ask is, you've learned a few over the years, so no doubt you probably by now you have a set routine, the steps you would go through when you were to learn a new language. So say if tomorrow you were going to drop everything and learn Cantonese or another language that you don't speak, I don't know, maybe Russian or something like that. I don't know if you speak Russian.
I do speak some Russian, but it's been a while since I've actually watered it, so to speak.
Yeah, so
but
if you were to learn a new language completely from scratch tomorrow, what would you do and how would you go about doing that?
Okay, so the very first thing that I would do, step one, familiarize myself with the sound of the language. I would have to probably know what variety of vowels are actually used in the language. For example, exactly how to pronounce them in some capacity. Also, to some degree, what sort of consonants I would expect. I remember last year when I was learning Burmese for the first time that I actually really needed to get used, one, to the vowels and the consonants, and also tones as well. That's also something that's significantly essential. And so the first thing is that for a language that is spoken, you need to really familiarize yourself with the basic color palette, which is to say what sounds are used, what sounds are not used. And so that's something that's primarily essential. Obviously, for a sign language, you would also need to know exactly what variety of mechanics are also used, but I haven't. I did dabble a little bit in ASL when I was in college, but to date I do not speak any sign language fluently. And so after that, I would probably go to omniglot.com, and I would, if present, I would find basic phrases like hello, how are you, thank you, are you okay, and things of that nature. And then I would use various mnemonic devices in order to actually remember them. For tones, it can be a little bit tricky because sometimes you actually need to connect various aspects of story to them. And so, for example, I don't know what variety of tones Cantonese has, but sometimes you would have a high tone, a low tone. I'm thinking of Lao, for example. You would have varieties of rising, falling, and also high and low. And so you would actually associate that with various actions, possibly imagining human beings in certain poses doing specific things, or also pretty much inventing things so as to actually create a very, very vivid picture in your mind. Also, using a notebook would significantly help in this regard, as well as, of course, this needs to be said, having mercy on yourself, because I think a lot of my students in my language teaching job, they expect to want to know everything very quickly, and they assume that every single mistake gets me very angry. And I'm going to go ahead and say this, that I actually like it when my students make mistakes, by virtue of the fact that it actually really encourages them to not be considerably scared. Because I think that in the West, I would say certainly in the United States, the standardized testing has ingrained, especially in many young people, a fear of punishment. And I think that that really is significantly subversive to goal reaching. To some degree, that might also be part of the point. And so another thing to keep in mind is the fact that once you really have these mnemonics of basic phrases, you would also need to say, like, to have, to want, various question words, who, what, when, where, why, how. Also relative pronouns, if there aren't any, like that, which. So, like, the person you are trying to reach is not available. And so that, or in order that. And so really once you have that, then you would have a basic understanding of really how to put sentences together. Another website that I would also recommend would be the Tatoeba sentence database, in which you can actually see a lot of sentences that are written and translated into many languages in the world by native speakers. And those will actually be significantly helpful. For minority languages that you actually brought up, one thing I would also recommend is I'm Jewish myself, and I actually do this, and I'm not ashamed to admit that I do this, but the Bible and also various materials for missionaries are also significantly helpful, because it's very interesting, because within the West, within primarily East Asia, Europe, and North America, you'll pretty much find a lot of material that's present by virtue of technology, by virtue of business, and things of that nature. And really outside of that, and I've really seen this with Fijian, for example, the primary material that really does exist in many regards is, yes, there are YouTube comments and also a variety of independent media that really comes out in the developing world, in addition to present in these languages alongside, for example, colonial languages like English, French, Spanish, or what have you, but also materials that's for religion, and primarily Christianity, and very confusingly sometimes in Muslim majority nations you can actually find materials that Christian missionaries have put out. And so
So
that's
going back to the things you said before, you said you went through, learn all the key phrases, all the structured words, get a sense of the sounds, get a sense of the script. So I just want to lay a few points out there. Assuming one of the first things I did when I started learning Cantonese, and I'm assuming you did the same thing, as opposed to learning these set phrases, you also learn words that are relevant to you. So one of the first phrases I learned was, I graduated from Newcastle University with a degree in chemical engineering. Now, that's not going to be useful to say for most people, but I think it's quite important if you want to be able to speak and about yourself, that you learn words that are relevant to you and that you can use right from the start. And then a few other things you said. You said familiarizing yourself with a script. I think if you're dealing with something, maybe Greek, Thai, Arabic, when there's quite a finite number of new characters or letters, then if you put off learning the alphabet, that's a bad idea, because it's just going to slow you down further down the line. But
that's very true.
I think it becomes a bit more tricky when you're talking about Japanese or Chinese, because potentially every time you learn a new word, there could be another character you need to learn, and there's a lot more to it. So I think there's a case to be made from putting off learning characters at the start, especially with the tones to get used to, and doing both at the same time can be overwhelming. But in the case of other languages, I think you're right, and say Greek, the first thing I'd do would be to learn the alphabet.
I agree with everything you say. And very interestingly, yes, the idea of being overwhelmed is something that some of my students have a problem with, especially with Hebrew and Finnish, both of which are significantly, as I like to call them, grammatical buffets. And so they do have a lot of grammatical concepts that significantly scare people. And so one result that I really tell people is savor each element at a time, take it in, and then ingest it. And then once you're done with that, then fully inculcate, then go on to the next element as well. And so to some degree, language learning, this is especially true for languages such as Japanese and the Chinese languages, which do have a multitude of characters, is a jigsaw puzzle. But very interestingly, it can also be a jigsaw puzzle that never ends, and by virtue of the fact that you primarily complete the frame, which I spoke of in a lot of the most common words or characters in the language, complete that, and then you spend a lot of the time finding out exactly how the various other elements fit in together. And you'd actually be surprised, and also in listening maybe to some people who may speak only okay English, or maybe just a little bit, exactly how much can be communicated exactly with, even with subpar grammar. And so the key is to be on the upward path. The key is to not be good instantly. The key is to always gain something, to level up, as it were. And so that's significant.
That's a very important point. I think one thing that I've learned is I've made probably more mistakes than a lot of people, especially when I say the wrong tone. I try to say one thing and end up saying something completely different, and it's not really embarrassing. It's a funny story to tell people after. And one thing that I always tell people if they want to learn is that communication is more important than perfectionism. Language is not, it's something that changes every day. Slang changes, you can express yourself in different ways, and it's more important to be understood than to get the right grammar. And if we wait on getting the right grammar, then I think it would slow us down and we'll never get to a point where we can express ourselves confidently.
And I'm so glad you brought this up because I can actually segue into a point in which some people, I think especially teachers and sometimes professors, speak of fossilizing mistakes. And I think that no mistake is so severe to the degree in which it can be permanently fossilized. I think that sometimes after maybe one significantly embarrassing mistake or something like that, you can actually have one mistake defossilized for good. And so that's something that should really be taken into account. And so, yes, I understand that there's the Benny Lewis school and the Steve Kaufman school, which one really emphasizes really using the language as quickly as you can, very, very quickly. And then Steve Kaufman does very much emphasize taking in input to a degree and then learning how to speak, quote, only when you're ready. And to some degree, it's very interesting because in Hebrew, we actually have this saying. For those of you who don't know, I used to be an Orthodox Jew earlier in my life. I walked away from religion. And now in New York, it's very interesting because pretty much I can do everything from every single activity. And so I can actually build bonds with some of the Orthodox Jews and some of the Reform Jews, or actually choose to not attend any religious events at all. And so pretty much I do whatever I feel like and I'm not confined. But in any case, in the Talmud, there's this idea, Eile ve'eile divrei Elohim chayim, which means these and these are the words of the living God. This idea that two seemingly contradictory notions can actually be completely true at once. And I think in language learning and in the polyglot community, there are a lot of people that need to take this into account.
I think going back to whether you should speak from day one or wait is quite an interesting question. But I think one thing that needs to be clarified is the Steve Kaufman's approach is the main thing that Benny says is if you wait until you feel ready, then you're never going to feel ready, so you're not going to start speaking. But I've watched some of Steve's videos, and what he says he does is he sets a target. So he says, when I hit 3,000 known words on link or whatever the target is, I'm going to start speaking. So that eliminates the feeling ready aspect, and it's when I hit this, I will start speaking. And before then, and even after then, I will have the main focus on comprehension, but I will start speaking at this point. And if you are going to wait to speak, then you should definitely set a goal, otherwise you probably won't start for a very long time, if ever, you know?
That's very true. And it's also very interesting because sometimes with some of my minority languages, in which usually I have to focus primarily on passive instinct, because the way I am in New York City, according to my knowledge, I just simply can't go outside and find a Kiribati speaker on the street, and so that's obviously going to be something I'm going to really need to search for. For example, I brought up Tok Pisin earlier, the English Creole of Papua New Guinea. I believe in the entire New York metropolitan area, there are eight, I believe, families from Papua New Guinea in the entire city. And so, as a result, I can't get this exposure significantly readily, and so as a result, to some degree, the Steve Kaufman method is very much forced on me. To some degree, also, learning a rare language does have a big advantage in the fact that it actually really enables you to actually get sick of language learning materials and then start using it in the real world as intended for native speakers with ease, by virtue of the fact that a lot of the materials that are present for learning languages from the developing world are aimed at missionaries and Peace Corps folk, and they usually need to prepare them to be conversational as quickly as possible and then throw them out into the real world. And so, as opposed to maybe some other books which may actually want to probably build a cycle of having more purchases or possibly an app getting you to probably continue to use it beyond a certain scope. And so that's significantly helpful because some people hop from one series of language learning textbooks to another, and then they never leave what all Japanese all the time calls the language learner material ghetto. And that really needs to be escaped as quickly as possible, which you need to pretty much only use the language learning books if you're a teacher and in teaching, and then in the real world, you pretty much, in having the basis in the language, you use only materials that is intended for native speakers. And no matter how small that language is, then chances are that material is available somewhere.
I think probably along the similar lines. It's when you first start in a language, you know, the beginning material is probably great to get your foot in the door. But the problem is language learning is a progressive thing. So when you start off, you need something like that. But if you stick with it for too long, you know, you're not going to get anywhere. So you ramp up the difficulty. So another thing, if I stuck with, I think, the Teach Yourself Complete Cantonese and Cantonese Class 101.com probably for about like 2 months, and I was just bored after that. You know, I wanted something more interesting, something more real to use. And then Ollie Richard Cantonese Conversations came out, which was native level conversations, full speed, all that stuff about interesting topics, cultural differences between UK and Hong Kong, all that sort of stuff. And it's just more interesting. I mean, who wants to sit there for months and months and months and listen to beginner's textbook? It's just not going to be enjoyable. So moving on from then, so that's how you would start a language. You'd learn words that are relevant for you, learn all the basic keywords, structures, sounds, tone language, learn the tones, new script if there is one. So and then you'd start speaking quite early on, I'm assuming. So once you've got up to, say, conversational fluency, say, I don't know, B1 or say B1 on the European framework, if you're already intermediate, how would you progress from there to the higher intermediate, B2, and then on to C1 and even C2? How would you go from...
So one thing you really need to focus in this regard is think about where you are using your language and in which fields you really are using it. And so one thing you're really going to need to know beyond the intermediate scope is that it's almost like you major in something almost, and you can also to some degree major in several topics. And so, for example, as a result, when I'm talking Yiddish, I primarily talk about learning other languages and also about adventures in the Jewish community. And so one thing I've really been doing is I've obviously focused a lot of my vocabulary primarily to learn about these things as well. And so that's also helpful. So that's one piece. Another piece of it will also be to find various varieties of literary forms that you can take in and also read them out loud, and through them you will actually gain vocabulary that you didn't even think was possible. And so with Yiddish, for example, I used the very rich traditions of the Yiddish theater in order to really acquire a lot of that vocabulary. The radio, a lot of this material that existed up until World War II. And so that was, so there were two bits. So one was obviously finding even more vocabulary relevant to the most common situations in which I was using it. And then, of course, using literature in order to bolster both my active and my passive vocabulary significantly. And obviously your passive vocabulary is always going to be significantly larger. And so that's one thing as well. To give another example, for example, among Swedes, for example, I would primarily talk about travel. And so as a result, one thing I would do is that I would find travel logs that, for example, in places that I either have visited or wanted to visit, and then I would find those. I would actually highlight any words that I did not know, and then I would also manage to recite the entire article out loud, and then ad-lib interpret it into English. And so that actually really trained me to actually give speeches about myself. Another thing is, because I'm a video game designer and I also really like games, watching Let's Play videos in the huge amounts of my language has also been significantly helpful as well. For example, RPG vocabulary, or, you know, talking about mushrooms and stars with Mario games, that's always fun.
I mean, you probably learn words you would never use in real day life. I was reading it's a Japanese manga, Gintama, but I'm reading the Cantonese Chinese version. And the word for samurai has come up like 20 times in the first few pages.
Indeed.
You would never learn that otherwise.
Yeah, and sometimes I think this is one of the big problems of the intermediate plateau, in which, for example, I remember one time when I was doing a Burmese level up mission in December, is that one of my big problems was that I actually watched a film in which there were a lot of monks. And so very interestingly, while I did interact with monks when I was in Myanmar of May of last year, I really didn't get used to a lot of the peculiarities of the way monks actually speak Burmese differently, and so I was left completely in the dark. And given exactly, well, I don't encounter too many Buddhist monks on the streets out here, despite the fact that there's a Burmese American community here in Brooklyn and, of course, in New York in general. And so, obviously, it's not absolutely relevant to me in the near future right now, unless, of course, I want to watch more movies featuring monks.
So, why how to get past intermediate plateau. I'm going to, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm going to break down what you said into three things there, I think. The first one was to said focus on specific topics. The second thing was to go for topics that are interested to you, that you find enjoyable, so follow the fun, follow your interests. And the third thing was, you said a lot about reading, listening to movies, so the third thing I'd say is massive input.
Yes, that's correct. But you also need to combine that input with your other senses as well. Reading it out loud, make it a performative action. And so, touching back on my Jewish heritage again, one thing that's very important is that throughout the various Jewish holidays, we have performative pieces. The various books of the Bible that are read in the synagogue are not sight read, they are read out loud. And some very religious communities literally read the same phrase for days, and I memorized all of them before I was 14. And so.
Right, yeah, that's really good. One other thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit, I don't know if there'll be anyone watching this in this situation, but there's a lot of people that I've spoke to that said, I just can't learn a language. I'm not very good at languages, and I don't know about your personal background, but in school I did French and German. I got a C just about in both. I wasn't very good at English. I got a middle B in that, and in 1 month of learning Cantonese, I was much further along than I ever was in after 6 years of studying French. And for me, it's because I was interested. It's a very personal thing for me. And yeah, I think that's it. So for those people that might be listening that say, I can't learn a language, or I don't have the talent, quite briefly, what would you say to those people?
Thanks for bringing this up, and this is a problem that I deal not only with my students, but even in the more immediate term, my family members. I believe with the exception of passive knowledge of Hebrew, I believe every single member, except for one of my extended family, speaks only English. So I only have one cousin who is fluent in more than one language, and then there's me, and then the rest of my extended family, I believe, on both sides only knows one language. And obviously, with the exception of being able to read Hebrew, which is another thing. One thing that is most essential is that you really have to connect a language to very, very good feelings. And so, for example, in the school, for example, in learning Spanish or, for example, Hebrew or Russian or what have you, a lot of people really associate the classroom with testing. They associate it with pressure. They don't associate it with culture in that regard. But very interestingly, outside of the classroom, people associate languages with real life. They associate it with friends. They associate it with new cultural experiences. And so, for example, Spanish in high school was very much testing. It was very much getting grades. But Yiddish in the real world was about friends. It was about theater. It was about many cultural activities with whom I would partake. And so there's really the positive feelings. And so if you manage to take away the negative feelings and bring in the positives as well, and this is also another point in which some people have had very negative experiences as well, for a number of different reasons. And so I just simply want to let you know that despite this, what?
Myself included, when I was younger, had negative experiences.
And so there was to some degree, there is tunnel vision in which people sometimes exclusively focus on very, very bad things. But to some degree, I want to let you know that throughout the entire world, the vast majority of people whom I have encountered have been unbelievably thrilled for me to speak their language, even if this just is a few words. This goes beyond the entire continental boundaries, across class lines, across linguistic lines, and regardless of how well they speak English or not. And so that's something that's of significant importance. And so one thing also I would recommend is I call this the chessboard theory, the idea that in order to really learn a language, you need to use all your chess pieces, for example. Like, you're not going to win the chess game just simply by using your pawns. And for some odd reason, if you don't really want to use that rook or that knight or that bishop in the corner and then use all of your other pieces, then you're going to be at a disadvantage. And so in order to learn a language, you need to... What?
To clarify on that metaphor, when you say a chess piece, you mean, say the pawns would be the grammar, the rook would be learning vocabulary, the bishop would be listening. So you want to use this very holistic approach. You want to use as much as possible and come from as many different angles as you can to give yourself the best chance of learning.
That's completely correct. And so, obviously, beyond a certain point, that would be how much music am I learning? How many YouTube or YouTube channels or radio stations am I using? Am I really making the temple to this language in my life as full as it could be? For my most successful language projects, I have built the temple significantly well. I can manage to recite a lot of song lyrics by memory. I've had newspapers read. I've had cultural experiences collected. I have a resonance to that culture. And for those of which it's lacking, it's usually ones of which I just simply slog through language learner materials day after day. So to give some examples of which I've succeeded, what?
Your most successful languages are the ones you have very positive and very fun associations with learning and using, and probably have real connections with either the people, the culture, or something else.
That's correct. And obviously, the first language I became fluent in as an adult was Yiddish, followed by Norwegian and Swedish. And I have a family connection to all of these languages, even though, well, how do I put it? I'm Swedish, but Norwegian is also very similar to that. And so there's that to really perhaps look inside yourself and find out really what you want and really what would provide significant mirth for you. And you'll get a certain warm feeling whenever you really think about that culture. And that's when you know that you've made a good decision. And so even if you don't have that right now, you could also build that over time, because building a relationship with a language is like building a relationship with a person. And yes, that means that the various ugly portions of the culture, no matter what it is, are going to come out, but you're going to have to learn to love them anyway.
Yeah. Okay, so what I was asking before my connection cut out was, so I'm going to leave a link to your channel in the description of this video, Jared. So I want to, for anyone who's watching who might go over to check it out, what are you working on right now? And if they come to your channel, what can they expect to see from Jared Gimbel in 2018?
Okay, so a number of things. For one, I'm probably going to be doing a lot more polyglot videos, probably focus more on endangered and languages, and also languages Oceania as well. In addition to that, I've also been doing some work with the Huggins International Challenge, in which I speak on camera, well, sometimes on camera, but mostly in a recorder for 30 days straight. What?
The 30-day speaking challenge.
Yes, you're completely correct. And so one result of this is that I compile all of the videos in the various languages. I compile all the recordings, and then I put them online with English subtitles. And so last month, January 2018, that was Hungarian. And for February 2018 right now, I'm going to do the Greenlandic recordings as soon as this interview is completed. In addition to that, I sometimes go through various language learning textbooks as well, and sometimes with a dosage of Let's Play videos on the side. I hope to actually be making Let's Play videos in other languages as well, but to some degree I think that I need to let my theatrical disposition flourish a little bit more and really get into the act, because I used to be very, very afraid of making videos, and very interestingly, to some degree I still really have that fear sometimes, and so I really need to get that fear out of me. And I think that this is also a good lesson for language learning as well. Concerning right now what languages I'm working on, Greenlandic, I was in Greenland back in October, and of course I'm going to continue to really learn that language over the course of the next few months. And another thing is Fijian, given that I am going to be in Fiji in August as things stand, and that's going to be something that is very exciting. And so I'm working on that, and so obviously before the year is out, there are probably a handful of other languages that I'll be focusing my time into. I don't focus a lot on the languages I'm already fluent in on my channel, because usually I use those in my classroom in my everyday life, but sometimes I will obviously drop little hints about them in my various videos as well. And of course, when my Fijian gets good enough, I will actually upload a video of me speaking it, and that will definitely be before August.
And I think you posted a status the other day about doing a talk in one of the upcoming, either the Polyglot Conference or the Polyglot Gathering or Langfest.
I can't say exactly what it is quite yet, but I believe, yes, it is almost confirmed. And yes, I'm actually going to submit the following details for that. Concerning these various events, the ones that you mentioned, I might or might not be at. It depends on what variety of things I'll have to do for my upcoming video game, and also another company that got on board with working on my video game is also designing another video game that I'm working on, and so it's very much like a love triangle of video games almost. And so, very interestingly, so I don't know exactly what variety of things I'll be at, but this talk that I'll be giving. Hopefully will be about how to learn an endangered language, including what exactly makes it different from, let's say, learning a global or even a small national language. When I use global language, that would usually be something like Spanish or French. When I say small national language, that would be something like Vietnamese or Finnish in that regard. The one in which it's not spoken among huge swaths of countries, but usually restricted to one country and its expatriate communities.
Yeah, like Thai or something like that.
Okay, so any other questions for me?
Any other questions? No, I think that's about wraps it up. I think we've rambled on quite enough. If people want to learn how to learn an endangered language, then I guess they'll just have to stay tuned for your...
Indeed. And I'm always available for questions. I'll give you my email address in the description accordingly. Or I could actually say it right now, jared@kavarini.com. So Jared, Jared, at KAVERINI.com. Kavarini.com. Kavarini is a Finnish word meaning a friend of mine or friends of mine. It's also the name of my flagship video game series.
Right, so I'll leave links to your details in the description.
Fantastic.
Thanks very much for coming. I hope people find it useful and they don't get too lost in our ramble. But yeah, thanks a lot for
okay.
Jared. Have a good day.
Likewise, Luke. Bye-bye.